as like a Mashiach kind of thing, you know. Jews suffered so much. The anti-Semitism was institutional. It was literally sanctioned by the government. And they were prevented from making a living. They were prevented from doing many, many things. And when someone came along with a prospect, with an idea that Jews could be equal to everybody else, and they'd have opportunity to raise their heads and to respect themselves and so on, a lot of Yidden bought in. It shouldn't come as a surprise. But what they were buying into was communism, as I'm sure you understand. Now, communism is a political system. Communism is an economic system. Why do you have to fight with God? You know, what happens if you leave God alone? What would happen if Marx, if Lenin, if Stalin had created the exact same financial model, right? Of this, what they call it today in America, the redistribution of wealth. It's much more than redistribution of wealth. It's everything belongs to the state. And whatever, we could talk about the economics, but that's not our department. And they hadn't picked on God. What would have happened? What would have happened? From a perspective of a revolution that they were trying to create, to give opportunity to the underprivileged people in Russia, it would have been exactly the same. Why they had to pick on God? I mean, there are reasons. There are very good reasons. Historically, there are very good reasons. But practically, it wasn't necessary. It really wasn't necessary to make part of the Bolshevik and the Communist Revolution a war against God, a war against religion. But that's how it was. They were just a tandem. They went hand in hand. I have a friend, an acquaintance. Can't call him a friend because he could be my father. He's the author of the book Samarkand, which I'm sure some of you have read. Hillel Zaltzman. He told me a very interesting story that in 1991, I think, they went to Russia. The communism had not yet collapsed. It was still officially socialist, communist. And there was a book fair. And they literally started putting tefillin on people in the center of Moscow, under the communists. The television, CNN reported it. It was like a big revolution. And one of the things he said to me was when they came to Russia, they were met by KGB agents. And they were not exactly interested in having KGB agents in their booth. And they said to them, we came here to help you. He said, we're doing fine, we don't need your help. He said, no, you're going to need our help because a lot of people are going to come. And they asked them, you connected to Chabad? We said, yeah. And immediately Hillel said to them, we're not a political body. And they said to him, we know. And the way he told me those 2 weeks in Russia, he was like walking on water. The whole thing was so miraculous. It was like they were doing tshuva. The KGB literally helped them put film on Yidden. It was such a reversal. And part of what he said to me was that they realized that there was no reason, if you wanted to create a new economic system, to give opportunity to people to make a living and to support themselves, there was no reason to start up with God. There was no reason. There was no connection between the economic system and the political change and the fact that they had to attack God. But that's what they did. They went to war against God. And of course, one of the most basic components of that revolution, of that war, was against teaching children. They didn't mind if the shuls were full. They wanted the shuls. It was good for propaganda that the shuls were full. But people over 60, retired people go to shul. They didn't want any kids in shul. Because they understood correctly that im ein gedoyim ain't yoshim. If there are no young, there's not going to be another generation. And they had a long-term view. They had a very, very good understanding of how you create and sustain. Making revolutions is not hard. Making revolutions stick is very hard. And they planned it for decades. That's why it was so successful. And they destroyed the opportunity for children to learn. And they made it a basic component of their civilization. They called it the Komsomol, the young communists. The kids should be indoctrinated in the ways of Lenin and Stalin. And the understanding was, you brainwash the children, in 20, 30, 40 years, the country is yours. They were right about all of those things. The Frierdiker Rebbe had just become a Rebbe. It was a brand new Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe. The story actually is that the revolution, the Bolshevik revolution, started in Leningrad, in Petersburg, which is on the Baltic Sea. It's the very top of Russia. In November 1917, the end of 1917, it was Tafresh Ayin Ches. And they pushed their way south. There was a civil war that lasted 3 years or more, until they took over the whole country, and then they consolidated their power, and then they began to assert their new beliefs on the Russian society. Russia is a very, very big country. And they came to Rostov, where the Rebbe Rashab was living, let's say February 1920. Tafresh Pei. 2 years plus after the revolution had begun. When they came to Rostov, the Rebbe Rashab said, Ich ken mit sein nit sein in einem. I cannot be with them. I can't handle this. This is too much for me. And if you know the history of Chabad Rebbes, he wasn't the first Rebbe to say that. When the Gezeira of the Cantonists happened in Russia, the Mittler Rebbe said, this is not for me. And he checked out and left it for his son-in-law. He gave him a wonderful bracha, a parting gift. So the Rebbe Rashab said, Ich kann mit seine Einem. And of course, one of the most compelling little stories that goes around, and it's a good story to know, the Rebbe Rashab said then, in 1920, Ich setze sie kein Sof nicht. Pardon me. I don't see an end to this. And then he said, Amol kommen a junger Mann. Anybody Yiddish? Anybody speaks Yiddish? Anybody? No? Amol kommen a junger Mann mit Zerissen in Schiech und wird sie herabwerfen. A young man will come with torn shoes and will throw them off. Now, if you understand Yiddish, those words, has a double connotation. He's going to throw off his shoes and he's going to throw off the communists. Now, I don't know if any of you are old enough, but the Rebbe wore the same pair of shoes for 18 years. Are you aware of that? Same pair of shoes. They were torn to shreds. There was nothing left of them. I remember as a kid, the Rebbe his shoes were just destroyed. And everybody assumed the Rebbe was wearing torn shoes because his feet hurt him. But I know this from the inside. Every single time the Rebbe came back from the oil, he asked, Rabbi Grona, the Zelbashich, you didn't buy me new shoes? Same shoes? And then one day in 1991, the Rebbe got new shoes. All of a sudden his feet didn't hurt anymore. And when you put the stories together, it gives you goose pimples. The Rebbe wore from 1974 till Nun Aleph, 1974 till 1990, 91, with the Zelbe Pashich, the shoes were torn. There was nothing left of those shoes. I remember those shoes. And everyone said that Rebbe wore torn shoes because his feet were hurting him, and then all of a sudden his feet weren't hurting him anyway, he got new shoes. And when you heard this word from the Rebbe Rashab, it gave you pause. So the Rebbe Rashab passed away. And if you know the history, and I don't want to spend time on this part of that story, he Poshet wrote his own ticket. The Rebbe Rashab's passing away, if you study it, he just said, I'm checking out. He wrote a will, got sick, and a week later he passed away. He literally decided, I don't want this, and he moved on. He left it to the Frierdiker Rebbe. Now, the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe's life, again, I don't know how much you know about the Frierdiker Rebbe. I have an acquaintance who some of you know, Rabbi Eliezer, David Eliezer. He's writing a book on the Frierdiker Rebbe. Maybe it's already published. I've been working on it, and we talked about it a little bit.
The biographies?
A biography in English. Right. He's making a historic biography of the Frierdiker Rebbe.
Part of the set. It's like a set?
I don't think so. No, he's writing a book on the Frierdiker Rebbe. Rabbi Eliezer.
How did he know the Frierdiker Rebbe?
He didn't. He researched him. Okay. I mean, he's alive today. He couldn't know the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe's life is a remarkable life. And the thing that strikes me when I think about the Frierdiker Rebbe was the degree of sacrifice. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't have a life. He mamish didn't have a life. On his 15th birthday, anybody have 15-year-olds? On his 15th birthday, his father took him to the oil of the Rebbe Marash and the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, and he said to him, I'm taking you to the Akedah. You know, Avraham took Yitzchak to the Akedah, yeah? The Rebbe Rashab says to his 15-year-old son, I'm taking you to the Akedah. I'm binding you to the Jewish people. I'm making you a public servant on behalf of the Jewish people, and you're going to serve the Jewish people with complete self-sacrifice, with total mesiras nefesh, as a 15-year-old. And he said to him in Yiddish, "Du verstehst was meint mesiras nefesh?" He said to his son, the Rebbe Rayatz, "You understand the meaning of mesiras nefesh?" And he answered his own question, the Rebbe Rashab did. Mesiras nefesh meint azoi und nicht anders. Mesiras nefesh means this way and no other way. When you look at the history backwards, when you look at the history, what we like to call objectively, what emerges is, in my opinion, the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, knew what the Frierdiker Rebbe would have to contend with. I mean, the Frierdiker Rebbe was the Rebbe of the Holocaust. I mean, it's not a joke. He watched 1 out of every 3 Jews be murdered. And the Rebbe Rashab, his father, understood that this job needs a lot of training. At 15 years old, he became a public servant, and he served the Jewish people for 55 years. The more you study the Frierdiker Rebbe's life, the more you feel bad for the man. Our kids love to say it's not fair. It certainly wasn't fair for him. Our kids complain it's not fair when you give them an ice cream that's a little bit bent. Yeah, the Frierdiker Rebbe's life was so difficult, and from the earliest of ages, his father made him a public servant. None of the Chabad Rabbeim were, forgive me for using this word, were sacrificed this way. None of them. The Rebbe became a Rebbe, and how old he was? He was 49. Until he was 40, he stayed out of the limelight. The Rebbe tried everything in his power to stay away from the noise. He had his own life, his own learning, his own davening. The Frierdiker Rebbe's life ended at 15. Think about it. And then when he turns 40, his father checks out. And again, if you read the stories, I'm not telling you all the stories because we don't have 4 hours. We only have whatever time we have, but it's not that much. And he leaves his son with this wonderful generation. And he wrote a will. Rebbe Rashab wrote a will. And in the Tzavah, which most of it has not been made public, but one page the Rebbe publicized, he tells him what he wants him to do. And he tells him, I want you to continue all the things I did. The Rebbe Rashab writes to his son, we made a yeshiva, the boys sit and learn, and they daven and they connected to Hashem. I want you to continue the yeshiva. Don't change the yeshiva. Don't let anybody affect the change in how the yeshiva goes. Continue spreading Hasidus. He gave him a traditional mandate. For a Chabad Rebbe. So the Frierdiker Rebbe becomes a Rebbe and he embraces the traditional mandate. Now it was a very difficult time. There was a war going on. There was a civil war in Russia. And the one thing all sides of the civil war agreed with is that they hated Jews. So both sides were committing pogroms. There were actually 3 teams at some point and in some places. And Yidden haben gelitten von allem. The pogroms came from all sides, from the red and from the white and from the black. And the Rebbe becomes a Rebbe. The Soviets, the communists, succeed. They pushed their way from the very top of Russia down. They took over the entire country. And the minute they took over the whole country, they began to consolidate their power, and they began to make new rules. If you don't work, you're a nobody. If you're a worker, you own the country. So if you were a Rav, that was a parazit, you understand? A rabbi, a school teacher. If you were a parasite. Why? You're wasting your time with religion? Who needs religion? Doesn't pay the bills. So it became impossibly difficult, and a lot of people ran away. People who could leave Russia in 1922 and 23 and 24 ran away. They left Russia, went to Poland, wherever they went. And a vacuum was created. All the big Rabbonim. Russia had the best yeshivas in the world. Russia had the biggest Gedolei Yisrael, the biggest Goinim, and mostly Misnagdim, but they were great people. They left. The Frierdiker Rebbe, 2 or 3 years into his Nesius, realized what's going on. And he made the decision to stand and fight. That was his decision. He's not going to run away. He sent his Bacharim, Tmimim, Lubavitcher boys, young men, just to reconnoiter Russia, just to find out what was going on. And then he started sending shluchim to all over Russia to replace the Rabbonim, to replace the Melamdim, to replace the Shachtim who had run off. And that became his life. So the Frierdiker Rebbe would say about himself, I did a lot of wonderful things in my life, but I never did what I was told to do. The mandate that his father gave him to maintain Chabad and to strengthen Chabad, He couldn't do it. He was busy saving souls. And but he was the head of the movement. The Frierdiker Rebbe was the head of the movement. He did incredible things under the nose of the Soviets. He did incredible things. There's a list, over 200 chadarim, all over Russia, 200 different cities that the Rebbe was personally bankrolling, paying for. It was American money, by the way. And that's a whole nother story. You read about it in Eliezer's book, about how the American Jews did or didn't support the Frierdiker Rebbe's activities. A lot of Jews in the West and the whole world were very, very sensitive to the communist idea. They really were, because they knew how much Yidden suffered. They saw this as an opportunity. So when the Rebbe said that the enemy of the Jews is the communists, a lot of American Jews did not want to help him. But the fact is, the work that Rebbe did, he did with American money. And he pushed the envelope. He pushed the envelope. In other words, if you look at it in hindsight, you're talking about a story that's 100 years old. He dared the Russians to arrest him. He dared them to stop him. And of course, the tragedy in all of this is that so much of the suffering that the Frierdiker Rebbe endured was at the hands of what was called the Yevsektia. You know what Yevsektia means? You don't speak Yiddish, maybe you speak Russian. Yevrei Sektia, that means Jewish communists. Many of them were former yeshiva bacharim who bought into this hope that there's going to be a new world and Jews are not going to suffer. And they're not going to be killed in the street because they're Jewish. Because officially, the socialist idea was everybody's equal. Now they would find out that the anti-Semitism does not belong to a political system. It's just the basic condition of reality. And many of these Yevsektia, Stalin would give them the same, what they called 6 ounces of lead that he gave everybody else. But this was the tragedy of it. When the Rebbe started, he was fighting with Yidden. Very painful. And he pushed the envelope. And he was a leader. He was the center of it all. And again, when you look at the story in hindsight, this is backwards, from today to yesterday to today, I don't think the Frierdiker Rebbe had an exit strategy. I don't think the Frierdiker Rebbe expected to survive. I really don't. He was going to do it until they stopped him. When they arrested him in Pezayin in 27, the same night that they arrested him, they arrested a bunch of other clergy. And they shot every single one of them. The most important religious leaders, Jewish and Christian and whatever, that night, the Soviets wanted to show the world that they're not afraid of external pressure. And that's how they did it. The Frierdiker Rebbe was supposed to suffer the same end. He just didn't go into the right room. He didn't go, he sat down to smoke a cigarette. He told him to go to a certain room. He sat down to smoke a cigarette. By the time he finished his cigarette, someone discovered that he was in and said, no, don't go into that room. That's mamish the story. It's incredible. He didn't have, the Frierdiker Rebbe was not trying to save himself. He really wasn't. This was Mesiras Nefesh without any limits. And Hashem saved him. I mean, that's the short of the story. God saved the Frierdiker Rebbe's life. And I think that's why, in the Frierdiker Rebbe's mind, this was a Yom Tov. Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz is a Yom Tov, because he did nothing. The Frierdiker Rebbe did nothing. He threw his life away as a statement of defiance to the time and the place and the circumstance. And God, Hashem saved him. So he saw it as a message from heaven that there's a point, that what he was doing was correct, and that ultimately the truth would win out, Yiddishkeit would win out. To make a long story short, and that's what I'm doing, I'm making a long story short, he had to leave Russia. He had to leave Russia for the simple reason that the underground could not have a leader. The underground had to be underground, and he was the center, he was the central figure. He became the biggest problem because everybody knew where he lived. By leaving Russia, the work that he started continued in what they call today cells, you know, and one didn't know about the other. In the Soviet Union, if you had information, you didn't want to know information you didn't need, you know, because they can't beat information out of you in a torture room if you don't have it. So if you didn't need information, you didn't want to know. As when the Rebbe was alive, he was in Russia, he was the center of it. And he put himself at risk, and he put anybody who came in contact with him at risk. So he had no choice. He left. That's why he left Russia. But that's the story of the bais Tammuz. It's a story of unbelievable Mesiras Nefesh. Unbelievable Mesiras Nefesh. But Mesiras Nefesh without a cheshbon. The Frierdiker Rebbe was fighting a war that if you look at it, like I said before, objectively, he couldn't win. He wasn't fighting to win, he was fighting to fight. I mean, Russia had millions of Jews. In 1890, 130 years ago, yeah? In 1890, probably 9 out of 10 Jews in Russia was Hashem Shabbos and Echel Kosher. Were frum. Within 50 years, those numbers were reversed, or worse. And this happened all over the world, that's the truth. The Frierdiker Rebbe felt that this is a war you have to fight, on principle. Like the Chashmonaim. When the Chashmonaim fought the war against the Syrian Greeks, Hanukkah, they didn't fight to win. They won because Hashem made them win. Hashem made a nes. Hanukkah is a big yomtiv because it was a great miracle. They fought because some things you have to fight. The Frierdiker Rebbe fought with the Soviets because he felt that this is a moment that you didn't have to, as they say in the real world, stand up and be counted. Mesiras Nefesh. This is the story. And again, you're all Lubavitchers, right? Like I tell your daughters in seminary, born, bred, and brainwashed. So you all know the program. If I haven't had your daughter yet, if she can't Beis Rivka, she's going to probably have me, and she'll get the born, bred, and brainwashed speech. You all know what I just told you. You all know. I didn't tell you any surprises. Let me move on to us, if you will. I had a grandfather, my wife's grandfather. His name was Rabbi Motel Shusterman. My wife's mother is a Shusterman. My wife's father is a Nemenov. They're both Zlobiner. So Zaidi Shusterman, Olav Shalom, who I knew, Reb Nissen, I did not know. He passed away before I married his granddaughter. Said to us that when they left Russia in 1946, he was on the same train with Reb Nissen Nemenov, who was a really, really big chassid, very special man. And as they were leaving Russia, Reb Nissen said to them, to the Anash, they were traveling on a train, he said to them, I want to make a declaration. That's how he put it here. Mir fahren a reis von an elam ha'emes and an elam ha'sheker. We're leaving a world of truth and we're entering a world of pretense. Sheker means lies. In the world from which we came, to raise your children to be Jewish was risking going to Siberia for 10 years. In the world from which we came, keeping Shabbos could send you to Siberia for 5 years. In the world in which we came, to be a shaykhet or a moyel or a rav could cost you your life. Now we're going to a world that if you raise your children to be Jewish, people are going to give you a pat in the back and say you're a wonderful person. You're going to learn Torah and say, wow, what a great scholar. So the reality, the black and white world that they knew in the Soviet Union was being replaced by a world that was 1,000 shades of gray. And every year, it's 98 years ago. Yubis Tammuz happened in 1927. Now it's 2025. 98 years that Fabrengen Chassidim get together, Yubis Tammuz, and have a Fabrengen. And they talk about what was. When I was growing up as a child, it wasn't what was. It still was. There was still a Soviet Union. My father had first cousins living in Russia, who he never spoke to on the phone because it was too dangerous in the 70s and in the 80s. Now it's what was. There's no more. In Russia, there's learning and there's davening and there's shuls and there's yeshivas. It's incredible. So we're telling a story that happened yesterday. And in so many ways, it's all it is. It's a story about something that was that no longer is. So the question becomes, so exactly what is Yud Beis Tammuz for us? Exactly what is Yud Beis Tammuz for us? And I think the answer is that the story of Yud Beis Tammuz, for lack of words, was, as they say in the Marines, a few good men and women. To live in the Soviet Union and to raise from children, you had to be completely out of your mind. You had to be so crazy. You had to have so much guts and so much toughness. My father, was born in Moscow. He was raised in Moscow. The way his father raised him was a reflection of the world in which they lived. Now, my father left in 46. How about those people left in 1972? They raised 3 generations under the Soviets. From Jews, from boys and girls, Lubavitchers. We know who they are. And life was so difficult. And the most difficult part of life was chronic fear. They were always afraid. They were not even sure of what. They were always afraid. You could trust nobody. You couldn't talk to your neighbor. Who's going to maser on you? Who's going to say that you keep Shabbos? Who's going to say that you keep kosher? Who's going to say that you teach your children Hebrew, God forbid? So you had to be connected to the Rebbe, obviously. The Rebbe gives koiches. And you had to be very, very tough. It wasn't easy. Yeah. Then we come to a whole nother world, which is so wonderful, right? As much as we complain about our lives, our ancestors would give their left hand to have our complaints, our tzaddis. We have the opposite challenge. It's not hard to be a Jew, but it's easy to fall asleep on the job. You know, the Yud-based Tammuz message for Jews who live in the West, which is basically all over the world today. But where are Jews afraid for their lives? In Iran, I hate to say it, Jews in Iran are afraid for their lives. Where are Jews afraid for their lives? Millions of Jews lived under the Eastern Bloc, right? What they call the Warsaw Pact, which is basically, I'm not going to say it's Mashiach, but it's basically gone. That world is gone for the most part. We live in a world where the test is a test of a non-test. That's what it is. Our life is good. It's easy, relatively speaking. Nobody is beating you up for keeping Shabbos. So the stress and the pressure that comes from outside, where it's a black and white question, am I going to keep Shabbos or I'm not going to keep Shabbos? And I'm going to keep Shabbos, I'm going to take the risks that come along with keeping Shabbos. There's no risks, there's no pressure, no one's bothering me. The test that we have is a test of assimilation. Rabbi David Edelman Alav Shalom once said to us in a Fabrengen, I knew it, but when he said it, it gave me such a jolt. He said that the Rebbe said something called the American Holocaust. 6 million Jews were killed in Europe by the Nazis. How many Jews in America have fallen asleep and have not woken up? How many Jews in America have slowly slipped away from their Jewish identity and they don't even realize what they've lost? You know the story? The story is as about 70 years ago, a grandmother called up her grandson. And she said to her grandson, Herbie, if you marry a shiksa, I'm going to commit suicide. So Herbie didn't marry a shiksa. 50 years ago, a grandmother called up her grandson and said, Herbie, if you marry a shiksa, I'm going to kill you. So Herbie didn't marry a shiksa, yeah? And then 40 years ago, a grandmother called her and said, Herbie, if you marry a shiksa, I'm never going to talk to you again. I'm going to write you out of my will. There's no grandmother to make that phone call anymore. There's no grandmother to make that phone call anymore because the grandmother doesn't know. Millions of Yidden in America, they're Jews. And they don't even know what the word means. It's a test. It's a test. Yiddishkeit is expensive. It's either expensive because there's pressures from the outside, or it's expensive because there is no pressure from the outside. And when there's no pressure from the outside, we need to stay awake. We need to value it. Torah mitzvahs has to be important. Shabbos has to be important. And really, the issue of issues, which is the story of Yud Beis Tammuz, and it's the test that faced each one of us. I mean, we're all parents, right? I'm a parent, now I'm a grandparent. It's the test of Jewish education. Of course we give our children a Jewish education. Of course we send. But our children need to know from us that this is literally the most important thing in the world. Shabbos, mitzvahs, Yiddishkeit, Chassidus. And it's a test. It's a test because nobody is testing us. And the opportunities that we have to live a wonderful life is all around us. And to be a Yid, and to be a Chassid, and to make the most important thing in our life is our children to learn Torah and do mitzvahs, is in an interesting kind of way tough. It's difficult. It's a different hardship. It's the hardship of, I got to stay focused. It's the hardship of, I don't want to be median. I don't want to be average. I don't want to be like everybody else. I want to raise my kids to be Yidden. And it's the inverse version of the story of Yud Beis Tammuz. And what makes this Yom Tov meaningful. Yud Beis Tammuz is meaningful because each parent in this room has children. Baruch Hashem. I hope you trust you have children. If you don't have children, all the money in the world, you can't buy a kid. And now you have to raise them. And you want the best for your kids. You want them to have the nicest life and the most peaceful life and the most protected life. But you want Yiddish Kinder, Jewish children. Jewish children, not just in name alone. Jewish children whose whole life is defined by Yiddishkeit. They learn Torah. Torah is important. Torah is their joy. Torah is their love. Mitzvahs are done lechatchila. Mitzvahs are done the correct way. We're not trying to cut corners because we have other things to do. This is the most important thing in our lives. Our home, our husbands, our children, our family. Yud Beis Tammuz speaks to us in a very, very different way than it spoke to the Jews in Russia 98 years ago. It was, how high a price are you going to pay? I was sitting with somebody in the last 48 hours who told me a story about Reb Mendel, which is really, really upsetting. Reb Mendel Futterfass, you heard the name of Reb Mendel Futterfass? He was one of the Chassidim involved in the effort of getting Yidden out of Russia, which was extremely dangerous. And they left in trainloads, eshalonim, a whole 200 Chassidim at a time. He put himself on the last train. But there were other Jews still left behind, and there was still hope to get more of them out. And one of his friends said to him, Mendel, based on your actions, Mesiras Nefesh also has a limit. So the guy got off the train. He left his wife and children on the train, got off the train, spent 10 years in the gulags, wouldn't see his wife for 15 years because some chassid guilted him. Mesiras Nefesh. Think about that. It's amazing. We don't have that problem at all. We have a different challenge. But the story of Yud Beis Tammuz is a Rebbe who inspired Chassidim, people like you and me. They were not tzaddikim, they were not holy people, to prioritize Yiddishkeit to the extent that they were prepared to pay whatever it took. And we sit on this date and we celebrate. This is Yud Beis Tammuz for us. Yud Beis Tammuz for us is take a look in the mirror and say, am I one of those Jews who's counted, or am I part of the community? Am I like everybody else, or am I going to make Yiddishkeit a iker for myself and for people around myself? It's a real challenge. And it makes Yud Beis Tammuz not part of the past. It makes Yud Beis Tammuz a part of our present. And this is what they never talked about. They never talked about Yud Beis Tammuz. They talked about Yud Beis Nefesh and Yiddishkeit. This is who we are, people. This is who we are. I want to say one more thing, okay? I got a little time left. I want to say one more thing. Before I do, in case you don't know who I am, I would like you to visit me on my website, insidechassidus.org. That's what I do. I teach Chassidus for a living. Okay, I have a website. I'll be happy to give you my card if you want it. Please check me out. Okay, I talk and I teach. I don't do so much preaching. Tonight is a Fabrengen, so Fabrengens are a little bit of a preach. But I teach Chassidus, and I'd love for you to learn from me if you would give me that honor. The Rebbe left Russia, the Frierdiker Rebbe left Russia in 1927. Then he spent a few years in Western Europe, and then he moved to Poland. When the Frierdiker Rebbe lived in Poland between 1933 and 1939, he had the closest thing to what the Chabad traditional Rebbe had in Lubavitch. He lived in a suburb, he didn't live in a big city. He built big yeshivas that were very successful in Poland. And he began to dedicate himself to a more traditional Chabad Rebbe role, davening, refining character, Chabad, that whole approach. A much more traditional Chabad type Rebbe. Now the Rebbe traveled all over. The Frierdiker Rebbe, when he came from Russia, traveled all over the world. He was in Israel, He was in America, he was all over the world. And part of the reason he traveled was because he wanted to decide where he wanted to settle. When he left Russia, the Frierdiker stationary for 6 years said temporary residence. Until he moved to Poland, his Latvian address said temporary residence. He was undecided as to where he wanted to live. He spent 10 months in America. 1929, they did 10 months in America. The Rebbe was healthy then. You've seen the videos. He looks like a king. He looked gorgeous. He was in every large Jewish community from the Atlantic till the Mississippi. He was in St. Louis, he was in Milwaukee, he was in Detroit, you name it. If there was a decent-sized Jewish community, the Rebbe visited. The Frierdiker Rebbe did. And he took stock of America then. America had millions of Jews. To the Jewish people coming from Europe, America was literally the land of milk and honey. America was so good to people in general, but America was good to Jews. They came to a place where they literally had opportunity to succeed without hate and without violence. I mean, the violence, the pogroms, it's a real thing. You look at a guy cross, okay. You call a guy a name, okay, but you beat him up in the street and you're allowed because he's a Jew. American Jews came here. They loved America. We still love America, I'd like to believe. But there was almost a sense of duty. When Jews came to America, they had to be good Americans. It was their way of thanking America for being so kind. And unfortunately, a part of that was that Yiddishkeit came second. Being American came first, Yiddishkeit came second, and there was an enormous amount of assimilation. When the Rebbe came here, the attitude that European Jews had towards America was the Treffen in Medina. You come to America, you lose your soul, you lose your identity, you assimilate. To come to America means you become a goy, as they would say in those days. The Rebbe changed that language. When the Rebbe came to America, he was interviewed by the newspapers. And they asked the previous Rebbe then what he thought of American Jewry. And the previous Rebbe said, American Jews are good stuff. They're sincere. They're well-intentioned. They just need to be taught. American Jews are going to create a great future for the Jewish people. So the reporter said to the Rebbe, Rabbi, we interview every great rabbi that comes here from Europe. You're the first one who said a nice thing about him. Every other rabbi said, the American Jews, forget about it. In a generation, they're gone. The Frierdiker Rebbe said, I remember Yankel Hecht, J.J. Hecht saying once in the Frierdiker Rebbe's name, it's a good teig. It's a very good dough. You can make very good bread out of it, but they have to be properly kneaded, have to be prepared. In 1947, 17 years later, the previous Rebbe who was already living here, said, 17 years ago I was in this country and I was asked what I thought about the future of American Jews. And I said that they have a very bright future. And I was told, but all the other rabbis are saying that, forget about it. And the Rebbe said, now, who was right? Huh? Who was right? The Frierdiker Rebbe said it. So he spent 10 months in America. American Jews fell in love with the Frierdiker Rebbe. You have to understand, this was the rabbi who defied Stalin and lived to tell the tale. He literally dared Stalin to kill him and survived. It was unheard of. The Frierdiker Rebbe, when he left Russia, had so much capital. He had so much respect in the Jewish world. He very quickly spent it. He didn't keep it in his pocket. But when he came to America, he was so revered. And he was asked to stay. An American delegation asked the Frierdiker Rebbe to live in America. Had he stayed in America, it would have been better for him in 1,000 ways. Not the least of which would have been his medical care, because he suffered from health issues for years and years and years. So the Rebbe said, I want to think about it. And several months after he went back, he wrote a letter thanking the American Jewish community for the kindness and for the treatment and for the respect. And he says, he didn't say no. He said, I need time. You don't do anything in a hurry. I have things I need to take care of. He never said no. He always understood that he was going to move to America at some point. I had a teacher, a colleague who could have been my grandfather when I first started teaching, who came from Poland, who said to us that they heard in yeshiva that the previous Rebbe said in Yiddish, Ich will sein Rebbe über Chassidim. Ich will nicht ein Rebbe über die Welt. Which means, I want to be a Rebbe to Chassidim, not to the whole world. And in Poland, he had that opportunity. And then the war came. As soon as the war came, the Rebbe made his way to the United States. And for the record, part of the reason that Rebbe was able to come into America as easy as he did, because he had already made plans in 38. A year before the war started, the Frierdiker Rebbe put in papers. He always intended on coming to the United States of America. He put in papers for immigration, and when the war started, those papers helped him come here more efficiently. And the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America as a 60-year-old man who couldn't walk and could barely talk, very, very limited physically. And when you read his writings, he describes himself asking himself, what am I going to do in the new world? What am I going to do when I get to America? What am I going to do? He knew that he's a Rebbe. He knew that he's a leader. He knew that he serves the Jewish people. But which direction? Is he going to continue creating a little cloistered Lubavitch like he did in Poland? Or is he going to take on the challenge of American Jewish assimilation and combat it? When he came here, all the people who loved him and cared about him wanted him to retire to the suburbs. You know that? They tried very hard. They took him to Lakewood. Lakewood then was a suburb, very peaceful, very quiet, very removed from the city. And they hoped that Rebbe would live in Lakewood, have a beautiful house, and Chassidim will come to visit, and they'll say L'chaim, and they'll say Chassidus. And the Rebbe insisted on living in Crown Heights. It's like moving to Beverly Hills, like moving to the most modern neighborhood in Brooklyn. Brooklyn at that time was the crown of New York, and Crown Heights was the crown of Brooklyn, and the Rebbe settled in Crown Heights. Why? Because the Rebbe said, I'm taking on America. I'm taking on America. And in his own talks, he says, imagine being 60 years old, broken in body and spirit, starting your life over like a schoolboy, like a kind, which is what he did. And he began to advocate for, if I may use these words, not giving up on any Jew, and giving every Jew what they're willing to take. You know, the Lubavitch is in America 85 years. And we're, Baruch Hashem, connected to the Rebbe, we're connected to the Lubavitch, and we understand a little bit of what the Lubavitcher mandate is. The Lubavitcher mandate is that every Jew has to be 100% frum and keep all the mitzvahs on the highest levels without any compromises. But if you're not willing to do that, so you skip 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, or you do 1 or 2 or 3, but don't do nothing. Don't be an apathetic Jew. Have some Yiddishkeit. This is a vision that the Frierdiker Rebbe started, that the Rebbe continued, and there are millions of Jews whose Jewish identity, as great or as small as it may be, is a product of this vision, of this priority. The Frierdiker Rebbe reinvented himself in place of the very insular, elite Chabad that was. We became the most pluralistic Hasidus of all our businesses. There's no Jew that's not our business. And there's no mitzvah which is too small. And at the same time, as much as you do, you have to do more. The Rebbe had to figure, how do you communicate those two messages? Everyone has to be 100% perfect, and if not 100%, okay, 99%. Okay, 1%. But epis, give of yourself to your own neshama. All of this, in a very real way, ties into Yud Beis Tammuz. The Frierdiker Rebbe's arrest and liberation, his leaving Russia, coming to America, all these events are connected, as he himself said. So this story that happened a long time ago in a different time, in a different place, under different conditions, is dynamic and in a very, very real way current. And this is what we want to take away from this Fabringen. Okay, we're out of time, unfortunately. But this is what you want to take away from this Fabringen. What you want to take, what I want to take away from this Fabringen, I'm the speaker, I'm the preacher, right? I get paid to tell you what to do, right? And you tell me, who's he? Who's that rabbi who's telling me what to do? Hopefully I listen to myself also. This is our challenge. The challenge is, each one of us needs to be awake at the wheel. When it comes to Yiddishkeit, we want to be very deliberate in ourselves, in how we raise our children. We want to take personal responsibility for our children. And we want to give them the best that we can give them, not just in the food they eat, in the clothing they wear, but in the Torah mitzvahs. And it's a test. It's a test. And the mitzvah, we're all going to pass this test. And Mashiach will come. So thank you all for listening to me. And please visit me at insidechassidus.org. Okay, a gute Nacht, Yiddische Kinder. Okay, if you want my card, I'll be happy to give it to you. You're welcome.